My name is Rachel Morgan, 32 years old, and on paper I had everything. CEO of Alpine Luxe Resorts, an empire worth $500 million, hundreds of employees, my name whispered with respect across the Rockies. Yet on a cold December night, my phone lit up with my mother's name, and her voice, half gentle, half sharp, delivered the same cut I had felt since childhood. "This Christmas trip is only for family. You can't come." In that moment, I realized some wounds never heal with age. To them, I was still the distraction, the daughter who didn't fit their picture-perfect postcard. What they didn't know was that the luxury resort they were bragging about online, the one they believed proved their own status, was mine. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My throat tightened, as though she'd physically pushed me out into the cold air beyond my window. I forced myself to stay calm to keep the tremor out of my voice. "I see," I whispered. On the other end, she exhaled like she'd accomplished something difficult but necessary. "It's better this way. You understand." The word understand echoed in my head. I leaned back in my chair, staring out at the city lights, and let her words wash over me. My family. The Morgans. We looked perfect from the outside, or at least they did. My father Robert, a 62-year-old retired attorney, still sharp and rigid in his judgments. My mother Linda, 60, once a grade school teacher with a heart that was never as gentle as her smile suggested. My brother Daniel at 36, their pride and joy, who could do no wrong. And Stephanie, his wife, 34, who adored the spotlight more than the holiday itself. And then there was me, Rachel Morgan, 32, running Alpine Luxe Resorts. But to them, I was still the daughter who hadn't grown up properly because I wasn't married and didn't have children. "Mom," I said, trying to keep the steel in my voice, hidden under politeness. "Is that really what you want? For me not to be there?" "It's not about what I want, sweetheart," she replied, her tone sliding into that patronizing mix of sweetness and superiority. "Daniel and Stephanie have worked so hard. The kids are at such a special age. We just want this trip to be about family, without distractions." Distractions. That was what I was, a distraction. I let the silence stretch because if I spoke, I wasn't sure what would come out. I saw the reflection of my own face in the glass, composed, professional. But behind my eyes a storm rose. "I hope you all enjoy yourselves," I said finally. My voice sounded foreign even to me, calm when inside I was shaking. Her tone brightened, relieved. "Good. I knew you'd understand. You've always been mature. Mature." The word stung, not as a compliment but as a dismissal, a way of saying thank you for stepping aside. When the call ended, I set my phone face down on the desk and pressed both hands against my temples. The city lights blurred in my vision, streaking like tears I refused to let fall. It wasn't the first time. Every holiday carried the same pattern. Robert would beam with pride at Daniel's every move. Linda would look at Stephanie as if she were the perfect daughter she never had. And I was always the extra piece, the one they couldn't fit into their perfect picture. I leaned back in my leather chair, the one that had molded to my body through countless late nights. My office smelled faintly of coffee and polished wood, a world away from the scent of pine needles and cinnamon that was probably filling my parents' home right now. Images of my family flooded my mind. Robert, with his commanding presence, never hesitating to lecture me about real responsibilities. Linda always smiling when Daniel walked into the room, yet sighing when I did. Daniel, the golden child who learned early that being the son was enough to earn love. Stephanie, who didn't need to try. She had married in and somehow still outshone me in their eyes. I closed my eyes and let myself feel the weight of it. The rejection, the years of being the outsider, the constant reminder that no matter what I built, it wasn't the right kind of success. And yet underneath the ache, something else stirred. A flicker of defiance, the part of me that had survived years of being underestimated. I looked again at my reflection in the window. 32 years old. CEO of a company valued at $500 million. Hundreds of employees depended on me. I'd turned failing resorts into thriving landmarks. I'd built an empire from nothing but late nights coding and grit. And my mother still told me I wasn't invited to Christmas because I wasn't family enough. I pressed my palm against the cold glass Denver's skyline sprawling before me like a challenge. If they wanted me out of the picture, I thought, let's see how their picture looked without me. I turned back to my desk, the glow of the city dimming behind me. My heart still stung, but the storm inside began to sharpen into something more focused, something deliberate. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. And in that silence, in the dim hum of my office, I knew Christmas would not pass the way they imagined. When I was a little girl, Christmas never felt like mine. I can still see the living room of our old house in Boulder, the smell of pine needles thick in the air, the golden glow from the lights draped around the tree. Every year, Daniel was lifted up by Dad to place the star on the very top. Everyone clapped and laughed, Mom's camera flashing as if it were the coronation of a king. And me, I was handed a dust cloth. Rachel, why don't you help clean up the wrapping paper so the floor looks nice for the pictures? Mom would say, her voice sweet as though she were giving me an important job, but I knew what it meant. Daniel got the spotlight. I got the broom. One Christmas in particular stays with me. I must have been 12. I'd just come back from the state science competition, clutching a ribbon I thought would make them proud. I'd worked on that project for months. Circuit boards soldered with shaky hands, notebooks full of calculations. When I walked in the door and showed Dad, his only response was a distracted, "That's nice, honey." Seconds later, Daniel came in sweaty from a basketball game, announcing he'd scored the winning shot. The house erupted with cheers. Dad pulled him into a hug. Mom practically danced. My ribbon slipped from my fingers and landed on the carpet. No one noticed. I learned then that my victories, the kind measured in equations and late-night study sessions, would never hold the same weight as Daniel's baskets. There were other Christmases, too. I'd sit at my bedroom window, knees pulled to my chest, watching the snowfall outside, while laughter and music floated up from the living room. Through the thin glass, I could see their shadows moving around the tree, the flash of wrapping paper, the glint of ornaments. I was close enough to hear, but far enough to feel like a ghost in my own home. Mom's words still ring in my ears. "One day, Rachel, you'll understand. You need a family of your own before you can really grow up." She said it every year in some form, like a mantra meant to keep me in my place. I remember asking her once, "Am I not enough already?" She sighed, touched my shoulder lightly, and walked away. That seed of rejection burrowed deep inside me. It grew into something harder than sadness, sharper than disappointment. It became a kind of fuel. If I wasn't enough for them, then maybe I could build a life where enough didn't depend on anyone else's standards. I remember the Christmas when Daniel was 21 and I was 17. He'd just gotten into a state college. Not Ivy League, not even top-ranked, but to my parents it was as though he'd been accepted to Harvard. They threw a party with neighbors and relatives. Mom baked 3 pies. Dad opened a bottle of champagne. People raised toasts to Daniel, the future businessman, the pride of the family. I had just been awarded a scholarship for a summer program in computer science. I mentioned it at the table timidly between bites of turkey. No one reacted. An uncle changed the subject to Daniel's plans for college football. I excused myself to the kitchen, stood by the sink, and whispered under my breath, "One day, I'll show you." That whisper became my vow. Year after year, I was reminded I didn't belong. Even the simplest traditions seemed designed to exclude me. Daniel carved the turkey. Daniel read the prayer. Daniel handed out the presents. When photos were taken, I was pushed to the side, smiling thinly, while my parents wrapped their arms proudly around him, and Stephanie, once she entered the picture. I can still feel the sting of a Christmas when I was 20. Mom handed Daniel a new leather wallet embossed with his initials. Dad gave him a watch. When it was my turn, I unwrapped a practical gift. An electric kettle. "So you can make tea when you study late," Mom said. They meant well, I told myself. But the truth was clear. He was the golden son, I was the practical afterthought. The ache of those years didn't disappear as I got older. It hardened. Every slight, every dismissal became a stone in the foundation I was building for myself. It's why I pushed through nights of coding when my friends went out, why I accepted rejection after rejection from investors, until one finally said yes. Sometimes, late at night, I'd close my laptop and think back to those winters. The sound of my mother's voice drifting through the house telling me to clean up while Daniel lit the star on the tree. The ribbon on the floor no one picked up. The window pane separating me from the warmth of my own family. All of it carved something into me. A need to prove not just that I could succeed, but that I could succeed so completely, they'd have no choice but to see me. Sitting in my Denver office, now staring out at the winter skyline, I could almost hear the faint echo of carols from those years muffled by walls and distance. My heart clenched, but not in the same way it once did. The hurt had been reshaped into resolve. I had carried those shadows of Christmas past long enough. This year, whether they realized it or not, they were going to see me for who I had become. And deep down, I knew they wouldn't be able to look away. Back in 2013, the year I graduated from the University of Colorado, I had nothing but a flimsy degree, a half-broken laptop, and a stubborn refusal to quit. I moved into a one-bedroom apartment in downtown Denver, the kind with peeling paint on the walls, and a radiator that hissed more than it heated. Rent swallowed almost everything I made from my part-time job, so most nights, dinner was instant ramen with an egg cracked in if I felt like splurging. The idea for my startup came that same summer during an internship at a small ski resort up in Breckenridge. I was assigned to shadow the front desk staff, and I watched day after day as guests grew frustrated with a reservation system that crashed at the worst moments. Families arrived only to find their bookings missing. Honeymoon couples argued with clerks who couldn't retrieve data, and more than once I saw grown men slam their fists against the counter because the system double-booked their rooms. It was chaos, but to me it was opportunity. I went home each night to my dingy apartment, pulled my laptop onto the kitchen table, and began sketching out a better way. The nights blurred together. I'd sit cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by crumpled notes, my only light, a desk lamp that flickered when the wind rattled the windows. Cups of coffee grew cold beside me as I pounded out line after line of code. Sometimes my eyes burned so badly I had to splash water on my face just to keep going. The old Dell laptop whined with every compile its fan so loud I feared it would give out before I did. But the more I built, the more alive I felt. I remember one particular night in January, the snow outside stacked high against the window. My fingers were stiff with cold because the radiator had died again, but I kept typing. I was building something no one believed I could. When I finally demoed the first version for a small lodge in Estes Park, the manager raised his eyebrows. "If this thing works, you'll save me 3 staff salaries." It did work. Mostly. And soon word spread. I signed on a few more clients, then a few more. But progress was slow, brutal even. I pitched my software to investors who smiled politely and then asked when I planned to settle down, get married and find something more stable. One older man actually chuckled and said, "You seem smart, but this is a young man's game." That comment stung, but it also lit a fire in me. Every time I felt like giving up, I heard his laugh in my head and kept coding. By 2016, after countless sleepless nights, my company caught the attention of a mid-sized tech firm. They offered me $40 million for the software and the small team I'd built around it. I should have been ecstatic. I remember walking out of that meeting clutching the signed contract, Denver's skyline glowing in the evening light. $40 million. It felt unreal. I called my parents thinking maybe, finally, they'd understand. My father answered. "That's nice, Rachel," he said flatly. "But Daniel's been promoted to marketing director. We're so proud of him." My chest hollowed. I smiled into the phone and said congratulations, even though what I really wanted to do was scream. I had just secured a deal worth more money than my parents would see in their lifetimes, and it still didn't measure up to Daniel's corner office. That night, I opened a bottle of cheap champagne alone in my apartment. I toasted myself in silence, swallowed the bitterness with each sip, and promised I'd turn that money into something so big even my family couldn't ignore it. That promise guided every step I took after. I founded Alpine Lux Resorts with the proceeds targeting distressed properties in the Rockies. Old resorts with faded carpets and broken elevators, once grand but now half forgotten. I saw them differently. I saw potential. The first acquisition nearly broke me. I poured every dollar I had into renovations, hiring new staff, updating systems marketing. I lived on site for months, sleeping in one of the drafty corner rooms, troubleshooting leaks and wiring problems alongside contractors. But when the doors reopened, bookings flooded in. Guests marveled at the transformation. With each success, I bought another. Steadily, I built a chain across Colorado and Wyoming, each one more ambitious than the last. By 2023, Alpine Lux Resorts wasn't just a company, it was an empire valued at $500 million. Of course, not everyone believed in me along the way. Evelyn Carter, head of the Colorado Hospitality Association, told me to my face at a conference. "Your background is too thin, your experience too short. Investors don't like risk, especially in the hands of a woman your age." I smiled that night, but inside I seethed. And when I cut the ribbon at Crystal Ridge, the crown jewel of my chain, I made sure Evelyn was on the guest list. She shook my hand, forced a smile, and whispered, "I was wrong about you." That moment I savored. But for all the accolades, magazine covers, and awards, my parents still introduced me at family gatherings as Rachel, she works with computers. Nothing more. So I worked harder. I expanded further. Each contract I signed, each renovation, completed each 5-star review from a guest. It all built toward something bigger than profit. It built toward that moment I dreamed of as a child, sitting by the window hearing laughter without me, the moment when the same family that excluded me would finally be forced to see. And now, as Christmas of 2025 approached with Crystal Ridge Resort gleaming at the heart of Aspen, that moment was closer than it had ever been. Stephanie's post appeared on my feed just after midnight, glowing from the screen in my dim office. The photo nearly blinded me with its perfection, the soaring atrium of Crystal Ridge Resort, the giant tree glittering with thousands of tiny lights, wrapped boxes stacked neatly at its base. My parents stood at the center, Dad in his tailored gray suit, Mom in a velvet dress the color of midnight. Daniel's arm curled confidently around Stephanie's waist, their children Emma and Lucas perched in front, both in matching red sweaters. Stephanie had chosen her angle well, catching the chandelier overhead and the fireplace in the distance, framing the Morgans like a glossy holiday advertisement. Beneath it, she'd written, "Finally a Christmas that feels right." The words burned hotter than the coffee cooling beside me. A Christmas that feels right. As if everyone before the ones where I sat beside them had somehow felt wrong. I scrolled down to the comments. The likes and heart emojis rolled in by the hundreds. "Beautiful family looks like a postcard. So perfect. Steph." Then a comment that made me freeze. Aunt Martha, our neighbor from Boulder, wrote, "Where's Rachel?" I held my breath, waiting, knowing someone would answer. Seconds later, Daniel replied himself, "Adults only. Christmas this year. Adults only." My jaw clenched. I was 32 years old, CEO of a corporation that employed hundreds, and still in my brother's eyes, I wasn't an adult. I stared at those two words until they blurred, as if my vision itself rejected them. Adults only. My existence erased in a casual comment. I scrolled further. Old friends of my parents chimed in. "So proud of you, Robert and Linda. You've raised such a beautiful family." Said, "The kids are adorable. What a blessing." Each word felt like a weight pressing against my chest. Beautiful family, a blessing, and yet in their portrait of perfection I had no place. I leaned back in my chair, the leather creaking under me, and let out a laugh, sharp and bitter. It echoed in the empty office, sounding more like a sob. I rubbed my temples, fighting the sting behind my eyes. The irony was suffocating. The chandelier above their heads, I had approved its purchase 2 years ago, hand-picked from a supplier in Italy. The tree behind them imported and assembled by my staff. Even the fireplace that glowed so warmly was part of a renovation project I'd signed off on personally. And they had no idea. To them, they were just guests at a resort Daniel had found living the dream of a flawless Christmas. To me, it was my creation, my empire, my sweat and sleepless nights woven into every polished surface of that photo. I clicked out of the app, unable to look any longer, but the image burned behind my eyelids. I rose and walked to the window. Outside, snow fell in lazy spirals, blanketing downtown Denver in silence. The world looked peaceful, but inside me a storm raged. I thought back to when I was a girl watching from the sidelines as Daniel carved the turkey or lifted the star onto the tree. My parents beaming me, forgotten. That same script played out now, only the stage was grander, the lights brighter. The screen of my phone buzzed again. More notifications. Stephanie had uploaded a short video. Emma and Lucas spinning around the lobby, their laughter echoing under the vaulted ceiling. Daniel's voice in the background. This is the kind of Christmas we always wanted. Exclusive. Perfect. Exclusive. Perfect. Words like daggers. My chest tightened. I imagined them toasting with champagne, Stephanie angling her phone for more pictures, Dad bragging to strangers about Daniel's success. And me, I wasn't even a footnote. The clock ticked, past 1. I sat back down at my desk, hands trembling, and opened the reservation system on my screen. I typed quickly, pulling up the Morgan booking. My eyes scanned the details: arrival date, spa packages, wine service, private ski lessons. The presidential suite reserved in Daniel's name. I traced the words with my finger on the screen. Presidential suite, the crown jewel of Crystal Ridge. I remembered walking through it the day construction finished, running my hand along the polished mahogany, testing the silk sheets imported from France. It was meant for the highest of VIP's celebrities' political figures, and my family, so smug, had taken it as theirs. I exhaled slowly, my reflection in the screen hard and cold. They wanted exclusive. They wanted perfect. Then it was time they felt what it was like to be excluded. The bitterness inside me began to crystallize into something sharper, steadier. For years, I had endured their subtle cuts and outright dismissals. Tonight, staring at Stephanie's curated image of the perfect family, I knew I couldn't let it pass unchallenged. They thought this Christmas was theirs. They thought it belonged to them, free of distractions, free of me. But the truth was simple. This Christmas belonged to me. And I was about to remind them exactly whose name sat at the top of every contract, every deed, every stone laid in the foundation of Crystal Ridge Resort. I closed the laptop gently, the sound of the click final decisive. Then I turned off the office lights and stood in the dark, watching the snow fall heavier against the glass. Tomorrow, I thought, tomorrow they'll learn what it feels like to be pushed out of the picture. From the top floor of Crystal Ridge, I could see them clearly through the pane of glass that overlooked the grand lobby. My family moved across the marble floors as though the place had been built for them. Dad stood tall at the concierge desk, gesturing broadly with his hand, as if to remind the staff of his importance. Mom sat nearby, adjusting her velvet scarf, her eyes following Emma and Lucas as they pressed their noses to the glass to watch the snowfall outside. Daniel and Stephanie, of course, posed in front of the fireplace, phones lifted high, their smiles wide enough for the world. I let the sight settle in my chest. For them, this was a holiday to display a performance of perfection. For me, it was an opportunity. I pressed the intercom on my desk. "Hannah, can you step in for a moment?" Within seconds, my assistant appeared, tablet in hand, her dark hair pulled into a neat bun. She was efficient, cautious, and loyal, though I could see the flicker of nerves in her eyes when I called unexpectedly. "Yes, Ms. Morgan?" she asked softly. "Pull up the reservation file for the Morgan family from New Jersey." 10 days arriving December 20th, I instructed, keeping my voice calm, almost casual. Her fingers danced across the screen, and within seconds the file appeared. She scanned it quickly before looking up. Here it is. Robert and Linda Morgan. Daniel and Stephanie plus 2 children. They've booked the presidential suite. She hesitated, glancing at me. There are also charges for spa treatments, premium wine service, private ski lessons for the kids. Several thousand already. I folded my arms, nodding slightly, my eyes still fixed on the lobby below. That sounds like Daniel. Hannah shifted, sensing the weight of silence. Do you want me to downgrade? I said, cutting her off. My voice dropped lower, deliberate, as sharp as the edge of glass. Move them out of the presidential suite. Assign it to Mark Reynolds, the VIP guest from Washington. Place the Morgans in a Mountain View room instead. Her brows furrowed. You want me to downgrade your own family? I turned to face her, fully leaning back against the desk. Yes, it's time they felt what it's like to be pushed down from where they think they belong. Let them taste humility in a place they thought was theirs. Hannah's mouth opened slightly before she closed it again. She was used to my precision, but this was different. That will be a shock, ma'am. They'll be furious. I let a small smile curl at the corner of my mouth, cold and steady. Exactly. Sometimes the best lesson isn't spoken. It's lived. She swallowed hard and knotted her fingers, trembling slightly as she typed in the change. And the dining reservations. Cancel them at Pinnacle, I replied without hesitation. Move the Morgans to Mountain Hearth Cafe. It's family-friendly, casual, warm. The food is excellent, but it's not a place for parading status. Hannah hesitated again. Should I give them a reason for the changes? Yes, I said, my voice even detached. Publicly, there's only one explanation, a system error. Tell them it was a mistake in the booking system and we're correcting it. Nothing more. She drew a breath, her shoulders tense, then nodded once. Understood. When she left, silence settled over the office again. I walked to the wall of screens displaying live feeds from security cameras across the resort. On one screen, Dad was laughing, his hand patting the concierge's shoulder as if they were old friends. On another, Stephanie tilted her head, just so angling her phone to capture the sparkle of the chandelier. Daniel stood behind her, smug satisfaction etched into every line of his face. I felt something tighten in my chest. Bitterness, yes, but also clarity. They had once decided I was a disruption, a distraction unfit to be included in their family portrait. Now they would feel what it was to be removed from a place of pride, to be told, without words, that they were not as important as they thought. I switched off the monitors, the images disappearing into black. My reflection stared back at me from the dark glass, calm but resolute. This wasn't anger anymore. This was something sharper. A quiet reminder that exclusion cuts both ways. I turned back toward the desk, the hum of the city muffled by thick snow outside. My pulse had steadied my decision made. This Christmas, the Morgans would finally understand what it meant to be on the outside looking in. The scene at the front desk unfolded just as I had imagined, though watching it through the discrete feed on my monitor made it almost surreal. My father's voice carried above the polite murmur of other guests, his tone sharp, commanding the way it used to echo in our house when he lectured me about responsibility. This is a violation of consumer rights. Robert barked, his palm slamming against the marble counter. I've studied contract law for 30 years. You can't just strip us of a presidential suite because of some so-called system error. It's unacceptable, and I'll see you in court if this isn't corrected immediately. The young woman behind the desk tried to remain composed, her hands trembling slightly as she typed. Sir, I truly apologize. The suite has been reassigned due to an internal error. We've placed you in one of our Mountain View rooms, which is still one of our most requested accommodations. Mom stood a few feet behind him, her eyes darting nervously around the lobby, as though the humiliation were a spotlight trained directly on her. Her hand fiddled with the clasp of her purse, her cheeks flushed red. Linda had always cared more about appearances than anything else, and now in front of strangers, she was being forced to stand small. Stephanie, clutching her phone, was on the verge of tears. Do you have any idea how long I planned this? The photos, the setting. The whole point was to give the kids a Christmas to remember. I can't post pictures from some standard room. Her voice cracked, rising in pitch until nearby guests began to glance their way. Daniel stepped in his face, a mask of frustration. He pulled out his phone and stepped to the side, dialing me. The moment I saw his name flash on my screen, I already knew how the conversation would play. "Rachel," he said the instant I answered, his voice clipped and frantic. "You have to know someone here. You always know someone. Call them, pull a string, whatever you have to do. They're moving us out of the presidential suite and Mom's about to explode. Help me fix this." I let a pause linger before responding, adding just enough surprise into my tone. "That's strange. Crystal Ridge is famous for flawless service. Maybe it's just a mix-up." "A mix-up?" His voice cracked. "They shoved us into a mountain view room. Do you understand what that means? I told everyone we were staying in the top suite. I promised Stephanie. Now it looks like we're ordinary guests. This is humiliating." I pinched the bridge of my nose, biting back the laugh that threatened to escape. "Daniel, sometimes these things happen. Maybe it's not the end of the world. The mountain view rooms are beautiful. The balcony overlooks the entire valley. You should take the kids out there tonight. They'll love the lights from town." His breathing grew heavier on the other end. "You don't get it. We've spent thousands on this trip. Spa packages, wine service, the works. Now we're treated like nobodies. It ruins everything." "Maybe not," I said calmly. "Maybe it's a chance to enjoy the holiday differently. Try not to let it upset you so much." "Not upset me," he nearly shouted. "This was supposed to be perfect." He cut off abruptly as though he knew yelling wouldn't help, then muttered, "Fine. I'll deal with it. Bum." The call ended, leaving me in silence once more. I placed the phone back on my desk and exhaled slowly. Downstairs, the chaos hadn't subsided. Dad was still arguing with the manager now, quoting statutes about implied contracts and threatening legal consequences. Mom tugged at his sleeve, hissing, "Robert, stop, people are staring." Her voice trembled between anger and embarrassment. Stephanie sat on a nearby bench, tears streaking her mascara, typing furiously into her phone, likely drafting a post to vent her frustration or message friends about the disaster. Daniel paced in circles, his face red, jaw clenched, the kids tugging at his hands, asking when they could go to the room. I watched it all through the silent screen, the image almost cinematic in its clarity. For once, I wasn't the one fumbling for a place in the picture. I was the director watching as the family that had excluded me from their holiday script stumbled through a performance they could no longer control. For years, I had been made to feel small. Tonight, it was their turn. I switched off the monitor, the echo of their raised voices still lingering in my head. I leaned back into my chair, folding my arms across my chest, and let the quiet satisfaction settle deep in my bones. This was only the beginning. The Mountain Hearth Cafe glowed with the kind of warmth money couldn't buy. Golden light spilled from hanging lanterns, flickering gently against the wooden beams overhead. The scent of cinnamon and sugar drifted from the open kitchen, mingling with the sharp bite of fresh pine wreaths nailed along the walls. Families filled the room, laughter echoing across the checkered tablecloths. At a corner table, my family sat hunched and unsettled, their designer coats draped awkwardly over the backs of chairs. To them, this place was a downgrade, a far cry from the marble floors and velvet drapes of Pinnacle. Yet for Emma and Lucas, it was magic. The waiter arrived with a tray of cookies shaped like Santa Claus gingerbread men, lined up in neat rows, and steaming mugs of hot chocolate, topped with swirls of whipped cream. Emma's eyes went wide, her little hands clapping together. "Look, Lucas! A whole gingerbread house!" Lucas leaned so far over the table his nose almost touched the frosting. "It's got gumdrops on the roof." His laughter rang out so bright it turned heads at neighboring tables. I watched from my monitor upstairs, leaning closer as I saw them tear into the treats, sugar dusting their small fingers. They giggled through every bite cheeks, sticky eyes shining in delight. Mom's shoulders, stiff at first, began to ease. She reached for her mug, inhaling the spiced steam. A soft smile flickered across her lips, almost involuntary. She glanced at the children, then whispered to Robert, "They're happy, happier than they were all afternoon." Robert grunted, still nursing his pride, but he didn't contradict her. Stephanie sat slouched in her chair, staring at her phone. Her perfectly curled hair had begun to wilt, her lipstick smudged at the corners. She snapped a picture of the table, but the dim glow and casual setting didn't flatter the way Pinnacle's crystal glasses had. She sighed, defeated. Finally she muttered, "They're smiling more here than they ever did at Pinnacle." The bitterness in her voice couldn't hide the truth of her words. Daniel sat rigid, arms crossed, watching the kids laugh as if unsure how to process it. His jaw tightened, then loosened. He tried to force a smile, but it looked out of place on his face. Meanwhile, Emma balanced a gingerbread cookie on her nose and made Lucas laugh so hard he nearly spilled his cocoa. The waiter returned, chuckling, and offered them more marshmallows. The children beamed as though they'd been given the greatest treasure on earth. The contrast struck me deeply. For years, my parents measured love in appearances in suites booked and bottles uncorked. Yet here, stripped of grandeur, their grandchildren had found joy in the simplest of things. Across the dining room, other guests noticed, too. An older couple smiled fondly at Emma's giggles. A young mother nudged her husband, nodding toward Lucas's frosting-covered grin. They weren't watching a family flaunt status. They were watching children enjoy Christmas as children should. Mom glanced around, realizing the scene wasn't humiliating after all. It was ordinary, even wholesome. For the first time all evening, she let her guard down and pulled Emma into her lap. Emma squirmed but laughed, her sticky hands leaving sugar on Mom's dress. Linda didn't scold, she just laughed with her. Stephanie, still clutching her phone, posted a photo anyway. But the comments that began rolling in weren't the adoration she expected. "Different vibe tonight," one friend wrote. Another, "Where's the sweet you promised?" A third, sharper than the rest, "Looks cozy but not exactly luxury." Her cheeks flushed as she read, and she locked her phone without replying. I leaned back in my chair, watching it unfold with quiet satisfaction. This was exactly what I wanted. Not their destruction, not public ruin, just the sharp sting of being forced out of the frame they thought they owned, the lesson that joy didn't come with a price tag. From the feed, I caught Daniel rubbing his temples. Stephanie slumped in silence, my parents softening under the glow of their grandchildren's laughter. The perfect family portrait they had tried to stage was unraveling, replaced by something messier, more real. Emma's voice rose above the clinking of silverware. "This is the best Christmas dinner ever." She bit into her cookie crumbs, tumbling down her sweater, her smile wide and unguarded. For the first time that night, I let myself smile too. The storm I had set in motion was already reshaping them, even if they couldn't see it yet. And I knew as I watched Emma and Lucas lick frosting from their fingers, this was only the beginning of the lesson. The next morning, while the children darted through the lobby, chasing each other with candy canes from the cafe, I caught sight of my parents at the front desk again. This time they weren't yelling, they were listening. The concierge leaned forward, lowering his voice as though trying to be discreet, but the words still carried enough to be heard. "Do you know M.H. Morgan?" he asked, polite but insistent. "Our CEO personally requested your family be made comfortable." I saw Mom freeze. Her hand, which had been resting lightly on the counter, tightened around the strap of her purse. Her eyes flicked toward Dad, searching his face for explanation, but he only frowned. The letters hung in the air like smoke. M.H. Mom repeated them under her breath. M.H. Morgan. Dad shook his head. No, relation," he said quickly, but the doubt had already taken root. Later, when they settled into the Mountain View room, Mom sat stiffly on the edge of the bed. She whispered to Daniel and Stephanie Harper. "Rachel's middle name is Harper." Stephanie raised her brows. "Wait, are you saying—" Mom pressed her lips together, her eyes narrowing. It's too much of a coincidence. Why would the staff say that? Why would they act like they knew us? Daniel scoffed, tossing his phone onto the nightstand. Mom, come on. Rachel wouldn't be mixed up in this. She works with computers. That's what you always said? She's not running a 5-star resort. But his voice cracked just slightly, betraying his uncertainty. Mom couldn't let it go. She pulled out her phone and called me. The moment I saw her name flash across the screen, I knew she had connected the dots at least part way. Rachel, she began, her tone carefully, measured, almost trembling. Do you know anything about this? About someone named M.H. Morgan? The staff here keep asking if we're related. They said the CEO himself arranged things for us. Isn't your middle name Harper? I leaned back in my chair, letting her words hang. My heart pounded, but I kept my tone light, evasive. Mom, coincidences happen. Morgan is a common name. Maybe you're just reading too much into it. There was silence on the other end, broken only by the muffled sound of Emma and Lucas laughing in the background. Then Mom spoke again, quieter this time. Rachel, it doesn't feel like coincidence. Not when the staff look at us like they expect us to know something we don't. I closed my eyes, drawing a slow breath. For years, she had looked right past me, never asking, never caring. And now when the truth pressed against her, she was finally searching. Mom, I said softly, you should stop worrying. Enjoy your holiday. The room is fine, isn't it? The kids are happy. That's what matters. Her voice wavered. Yes, but I'll talk to you later. I cut in gently, firm enough to end it. When I hung up, I let the silence swallow me. The snow outside drifted heavier, blanketing the mountains in white. I pressed my hands flat against the desk, steadying myself. The moment I'd waited for was coming closer. The suspicion had taken hold. Downstairs, I imagined them sitting in that room, Mom whispering possibilities, Dad brushing them off, Daniel insisting it couldn't be true. Stephanie silently scrolling through her phone, chewing her lip. The seed of doubt was there now, spreading through them like cracks in glass. And soon enough, those cracks would shatter. The cafe smelled of butter and maple syrup. When I walked through the door that morning, the hood of my dark blue coat pulled low. Wooden tables glowed under warm light, families crowded together over pancakes and eggs. The kind of scene that always felt more real to me than chandeliers and polished silver. Before I even spotted them, I heard it. Aunt Rachel, Emma's voice, pierced the air like a bell, and suddenly she was flying toward me, Lucas stumbling close behind. Their little arms wrapped around my legs, sticky from syrup, their faces lit up with joy. I bent down, hugging them tight, inhaling the simple sweetness of their presence. Good morning, I whispered, brushing Emma's hair back. Did you sleep well? We had pancakes shaped like reindeer, Lucas shouted, bouncing on his toes. You have to try them. Behind them, my parents and brother froze. Forks clattered against plates. My father's jaw went rigid, his phone slipping from his hand onto the table with a sharp crack. Mom's hand lifted slowly to her mouth, trembling. Daniel sat stiff, spoon suspended in midair. Stephanie blinked rapidly, her face pale. I straightened the children still clinging to me and stepped toward their table. The hum of chatter in the cafe seemed to dim the scrape of chairs and clink of silverware, fading into silence. Mom's voice came first, so quiet it barely carried. You're the owner, aren't you? I met her eyes steady. Yes, Mom, I am. The words dropped between us like a stone in water, ripples spreading through every face at that table. I pulled off my hood and scarf, revealing myself fully, not as the daughter they'd dismissed, but as the woman I had built. 10 years ago, I started with nothing but a laptop in a tiny Denver apartment. I coded until my fingers shook until the radiator died, and I could see my breath while I worked. 3 years later, I sold that startup for $40 million, and I didn't stop. I poured every cent into hospitality, into resorts that everyone else said were too far gone. I rebuilt them one by one until Alpine Lux Resorts was worth $500 million. Crystal Ridge is mine. All of it. No one spoke. Dad's knuckles whitened as he gripped the table. Daniel's eyes dropped to his plate, shame crawling across his face. Stephanie blinked down at her phone as if hoping to vanish into the screen. I leaned forward, my voice lowering but sharp enough to cut. Do you remember that Christmas when Daniel was chosen to hang the ornaments while I was told to shovel snow outside? My fingers went numb, my cheeks stung from the wind, but all I wanted was to be inside part of the picture. Instead, I stood in the cold while you all gathered around the tree. Mom's lips quivered. Rachel, I raised my hand gently, stopping her. You've repeated that scene every year since. Daniel shines, I'm sent to the sidelines. Even when I built everything you see here in your eyes, I was still just the girl with computers, not worthy of a seat at your table. The children looked up at me confused, sensing the tension but not the weight of history pressing down. I softened my tone for them. But that's over now. You need to understand who I am. Not who you decided I was. Emma tugged at my sleeve, her eyes wide. You built this whole place. I crouched down, brushing sugar from her cheek. Yes, sweetheart. I did. Her smile spread pure and unfiltered. That's so cool. I stood again, turning back to the adults. For once, I want you to sit in the discomfort of knowing the daughter you pushed away built the very walls around you. The table sat in silence. Dad finally exhaled, slow and heavy, his gaze dropping. Mom's eyes glistened with tears. Daniel rubbed his temples and Stephanie shifted uncomfortably, biting her lip. The reveal was complete. The truth no longer a whisper in the halls or a suspicion muttered between them. It was out in the open, undeniable, sharp as glass. And for the first time in my life, they were the ones left speechless. I stood there, the weight of silence pressing against me, and finally let the words spill, the ones I had held back for years. Do you know what it feels like to be treated as less than in your own family? Every Christmas, every holiday. It was Daniel at the center. Daniel praised, Daniel chosen. And me, I was the one told to fetch, to clean, to make space. You made it very clear who mattered and who didn't. Mom's eyes darted down to the tablecloth, her fingers twisting the fabric as if she could wring the truth out of it. Dad straightened his voice hard, almost snapping. Don't exaggerate. We gave you every opportunity. Education, a roof, stability. You took a different path. That was your choice. My chest tightened, but I didn't back down. No, Dad. You gave Daniel the spotlight. You gave me scraps. Even when I sold my first company for $40 million, you couldn't even say you were proud. All I heard was how Daniel had landed a promotion. You never saw me. Not once. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, his fork clinking against his plate. He lowered his head, and when he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse. She's right. Mom looked up, startled. Daniel! No, Mom, he said, rubbing his temple. I always thought Rachel was smaller somehow, not capable of anything big. I believed it because you did. I thought she'd always be the one trailing behind. His eyes lifted toward me, filled with something I hadn't seen in him before. Shame. I was wrong. The air between us tightened, the tension snapping like a wire pulled too far. Dad slammed his hand down, making the silverware jump. This doesn't change the fact that you manipulated this situation. You think you can humiliate your own family? I could sue this resort under hospitality law, under consumer protections. You've violated... Before he could finish, the sound of heels clicked against the wooden floor. Hannah stepped inside holding a neat folder. Her voice was calm, professional. Mr. Morgan, if I may. She opened the folder and laid out several documents on the table. Here are the contracts and terms of service your son agreed to when booking. Please note the clause regarding reallocation of rooms in the case of priority guests. And here are the consumer rights disclosures under Colorado hospitality regulations. Nothing unlawful has occurred. Dad's mouth opened, then closed. His face flushed deep red. He looked at the papers, then at Hannah, and finally at me. For the first time in my life, Robert Morgan had no words. Hannah gave a polite nod and stepped back, her presence steady as stone. Mom suddenly broke, her voice cracking as tears spilled down her cheeks. "Rachel, I just thought it was easier to go along with Daniel. He was the son. He fit the mold. Supporting him made sense, and you were different. I told myself you were strong enough not to need us. But the truth is, I didn't want to fight. I chose easy." Her sobs filled the cafe, raw and unguarded. Stephanie sat frozen, her hands folded in her lap, her phone long forgotten. Daniel stared at his mother, then back at me, his lips pressed tight. I felt my breath steady. This was it, the moment I had waited for. Not the money, not the empire, not even their recognition. This was the fracture, the tearing open of the lies they had told themselves for decades. I looked at each of them, my voice low but firm. "You built a family where only one child mattered, and you convinced yourselves that was normal. But it wasn't. It never was. And now, sitting in this room, you can't run from it anymore." No one answered. The sound of Emma and Lucas laughing outside the cafe drifted in faintly, a piercing reminder of innocence untouched by bitterness. The silence that followed wasn't the old silence of dismissal. It was heavier, sharper. The silence of people forced to face a truth they could no longer deny. I pushed open the heavy door that led to the main kitchen, and the family hesitated behind me before stepping inside. The heat hit us immediately, along with the savory aroma of roasting meats and the sweetness of pies cooling on racks. Chefs in tall white hats moved with precision, shouting orders over the clang of pans, their sleeves rolled up, steam rising around them like mist. Emma gasped, clutching my hand. "It's like a cooking show." Lucas's eyes widened as he spotted a massive pot bubbling on the stove. He tried to lean closer, but I gently pulled him back. "Careful," I warned, smiling. "That's hot enough to cook a turkey." Dad looked around, eyebrows raised, despite himself. "I never realized how much work went into this. From the dining room, it all looks effortless." "That's the point," I said, watching a pastry chef drizzle icing over a tray of gingerbread men. "The guests see perfection, but back here is where the real labor happens, where the burns, the blisters, the exhaustion live." Mom nodded faintly, her eyes following a young woman hefting trays twice her size. "It's humbling." From the kitchen, we moved outside, the cold air cutting sharp after the heat inside. The slopes stretched before us, dazzling under the morning sun. The snow glittered like scattered diamonds. Groups of children bundled in bright jackets struggled to balance on skis, their laughter and falls echoing against the mountainside. Emma tugged on my coat. "Can we try?" Lucas jumped in before I could answer. "Please, Aunt Rachel." Just once down the bunny hill, I crouched, meeting their eager eyes. "You'll have to start with the beginner class." "But it's safe. Instructors and ski patrol are always nearby." They both nodded vigorously, their excitement contagious. Daniel watched them, arms crossed at first, then slowly lowering. His voice came quieter than usual. "I have to admit, this is more professional than I imagined. The staff, the safety measures? It's impressive." I only gave a small nod, letting the admission settle without comment. The cracks in his arrogance were widening. Finally, I led them to the top floor, swiping my keycard to open the glass doors to my office. They stepped inside, stunned into silence. The room stretched, wide floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Rockies, the peaks wrapped in snow. The walls were lined with maps framed contracts, industry awards. A large photograph showed me surrounded by my team at the grand opening of another resort. Mom's voice came out barely above a whisper. "You really run all of this from here?" "Yes," I said simply. "This is where every decision happens, where every late night, every risk, every sacrifice led." Emma wandered to a wall of plaques, tracing the gold lettering with her small fingers. Then she turned, her brow furrowed in curiosity. "Aunt Rachel, are you rich?" The room went still. Everyone's eyes shifted to me. I knelt to Emma's level, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "I'm successful," I answered gently, "and I'm happy. Being rich is just numbers. What matters is building something you believe in." Emma smiled, satisfied, and Lucas whispered with awe, "I want to grow up to be like you." A lump rose in my throat. I ruffled his hair, forcing a steady voice. "Then remember this. Never let anyone tell you you're not good enough just because you're different." The room grew quiet again, but it wasn't the silence of judgment or dismissal. It was the silence of recognition. For the first time, they were seeing me. Not the girl they had cast aside, but the woman who had built a mountain of her own. And for a fleeting moment, standing there with the Rockies blazing white beyond the glass, I felt something like peace. The dining room at Pinnacle shimmered with candlelight, the flames dancing off crystal glasses and polished silver. The long mahogany table had been set with care, china plates edged with gold-folded linen napkins tied with sprigs of holly, and centerpieces of white roses nestled in pine branches. It was elegant, but it wasn't staged for a photograph. It was meant to be shared. I watched my family enter hesitantly, their steps slowing as they took in the space. Daniel's shoulders slumped as though he no longer had the energy to posture. Stephanie followed behind, her phone in her hand, but unused for once. Mom and Dad moved cautiously, their eyes darting toward me before they sat. Emma and Lucas ran ahead, sliding into their chairs with giddy excitement, their laughter bouncing against the high ceiling. When everyone was settled, I raised my glass lightly. "Merry Christmas," I said, my voice even. "Tonight isn't about sweets or photographs. It's about us. So let's begin." The servers moved quietly, placing dishes before us. Roast turkey with rosemary bowls of mashed potatoes whipped to silk, candied yams gleaming under toasted marshmallows. The room filled with the aromas of comfort and tradition, and for the first time in years, it felt like we were sitting down to something real. The first words came from my father. He set down his fork, his usually stern face softening. "Rachel," he began, clearing his throat, "I owe you an apology, many apologies. I thought success meant something it didn't. I was blinded by what I wanted to see in Daniel, and in doing so I refused to see you at all. That was my mistake." His voice cracked, and for a moment he looked smaller than I had ever seen him. Mom reached for my hand, her eyes wet. I was wrong too. I thought if I followed Daniel's lead, if I supported him, no matter what, it would keep the family together. But all it did was leave you outside. I promise you, Rachel, that will never happen again. The words hit me harder than I expected. Promises had been made before and broken. But tonight I could hear the weight in her voice, the quiver of truth. Daniel leaned forward, his hands clasped tight. I've acted like I knew what being grown meant. I thought my title, my kids, my house made me better. But the truth is, I was the one who hadn't grown at all. You surpassed me years ago. Rachel and I refused to admit it. I'm sorry." The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was steady, like a pause for breath after running. I lifted my glass, looking at each of them, letting the moment stretch long enough to sink in. "Then let's not dwell on the past," I said softly. "Let's raise a glass to what we've learned, to Christmas lessons." They repeated after me, voices uneven but united. "To Christmas lessons." The chime of crystal filled the air, gentle and sharp all at once. For a while there was no speech, no performance, just the sound of knives scraping plates, of Emma humming a carol as she ate, of Lucas telling a story about the ski slopes. Mom laughed softly at his antics, and even Dad cracked a smile. Stephanie, quiet for most of the night, finally set down her phone and joined the conversation, her guard lowered. I sat back, sipping my wine, letting the warmth spread through me. For the first time, I wasn't looking in from the outside. I was at the table not because they gave me a seat, but because I built it myself. Later, when dinner ended and dessert was served, pumpkin pie topped with whipped cream, chocolate truffles nestled in silver wrappers, I slipped away to the tall windows. Snow fell steadily outside, cloaking the mountains in white. The reflection of the candles behind me shimmered against the glass, merging with the stars above. My voice carried only inside my head, but I knew the words were meant for more than me. "If your family doesn't give you a seat," I whispered, "build your own table." I turned back to them, my family laughing gently at some story Lucas was telling, and I felt a rare stillness in my chest. Not closure, because families don't change in a night, but the beginning of something new. And to you listening to this story, I'll ask, have you ever been pushed aside, told you weren't enough, left out of the picture? Share your story. Tell me how you found your way back or how you built a table of your own, because sometimes those lessons are the ones worth raising a glass to.